Just a few notes to begin. We know about the nation of Israel. In the Old Testament, it always refers to Israel as Israel. But in the New Testament, many times Israel is referred to as Palestine. Why? Because in the Old Testament, the Hebrews, the Israelites, were in charge of Israel. They called it Israel. But when Rome conquered that area, they called it Palestine. Israel is Old Testament. Palestine / Israel is New Testament. Palestine is only used in the New Testament. That's why it is safe to call Jesus a Palestinian Jew. Nowadays, that seems like a contradiction in terms. How could you be Palestinian and Jewish? Well, actually, there are a lot of Palestinian Jews, but the press doesn't report that. But we know of one big one, the guy in the window. That tells you about what side of the issue we should be on, right? Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. The last thing I'll say is a term I explained last week, a term that I call aggressive, or at the very least, assertive nonviolence. Aggressive nonviolence, again, sounds like a contradiction. But that's really what Jesus is about, aggressively, assertively being nonviolent. All right. So last week we had a live demonstration, thank you Dave Dwyer, of Jesus' famous line, "Turn the other cheek." We learned that turning the other cheek does not mean voluntarily succumbing to being hit a second time. And so Jesus' instructions then not only spare victims additional physical injury and emotional hurt, but allow them to be the victors who treat their opponent with dignity, as a Jesus follower should. With Pennsylvania ranking in the top 5 states for Thanksgiving dinner drama, this is a timely lesson. Now, before moving on to these other two famous quotes, I want to consider the original audience to whom Jesus was speaking. Those people were by and large engaged in what economists call subsistence living, as the agricultural underclass comprised of farmers, shepherds, fishermen, and related craftsmen. All of them were ill or uneducated, politically powerless, disenfranchised in the truest sense, and often persecuted. More simply stated, Jesus addressed a population of victims. Now, I want to be clear, they did not necessarily think of themselves as victims. Good for them. But Rome and the upper classes certainly lorded it over them as a way of life. And Jesus knew that the many insults and day-to-day aggravations endured by these lower classes really took a toll on them. These were a beleaguered people who needed encouraging good news to uplift them and help them through daily life. First century Roman Palestine then was typified by power relationships. Either honor or shame. Domination, humiliation were the norm. It was okay for a master to strike a slave. It was expected that a wealthy creditor go after a penniless debtor. It was acceptable for an army of occupation to commandeer property and press civilians into laborious service. These actions we recognize as wrong. But in Roman Palestine, they were legal. They added then insult to injury by skewing the equation even more in favor of the powerful and against the powerless. That's what the law did. Take, for example, recovering debts. The debtors in question here are not frauds, cheats, and liars. They were the working poor, caught in a cycle of poverty. They were honest people, completely down on their luck, trying to provide for themselves and their families with an honest day's work. But they were unable to pay their debts. Any attempt to make them pay was like getting blood from a stone. It wasn't going to happen. Abject poverty. A little more updated story is from Deb's family when her father was forever changed during the Depression when the bank called the loan on his family's house. Even though they never missed a mortgage payment, his father held a steady job, they were forced to surrender their home. Doesn't that change a person's perspective on life? But things like home ownership, private property for all classes, savings accounts, investments, pension funds, and Social Security, that was unknown to the masses 2,000 years ago in Palestine. I mean, the only possessions that most persons had were quite literally the clothes on their back. Maybe some cooking utensils. Maybe even an animal or two. If the individual was a tradesman, and again, they were men in those days, he may have had some tools of the trade too, but that was even unlikely. The tools were probably owned by the landowner who let the tradesman use them or borrow them or maybe charged rent for them. Anybody that grew up in the coal regions or knows about coal country here in Pennsylvania understands how some of that works with company stores and renting property and all that stuff. Lower class people had it tough. So how does Jesus address this problem with debtors? His exact quote is, "If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well." Now, we may not know the difference between coat and cloak. Here's what it is. Coat and cloak were the only two articles of clothing generally worn by men in Jesus' time. In today's English, it would read, "If anyone wants to sue you, Mr. Farmer, and take your overalls, give your underwear too." I'm not kidding. Historically, the average Jew and Gentile lost everything to wealthy landowners who themselves were in the process of losing everything to a Roman government bent on enforcing obscene tax rates. Joe and Joanna Jew had no property in terms of land or goods and found themselves heavily indebted. It was not uncommon, therefore, for their landlord, fearing prison himself for not paying the high taxes, to take his debtors to court in order to demonstrate to the government's judge that the landlord was doing everything in his power to pay the tax money owed, even if that included going after pauper. Honestly, it was more theater than true justice. I mean, when a peasant was so far sunken into poverty, the only thing that the landlord could sue for was a man's most cherished possession, namely his overalls. And guess what he sued for? His overalls. But the debtor could succeed in this game of one-upmanship by not only giving up the overalls, but removing his underwear too. Exactly what Jesus advises. Picture this: a poor man standing naked in the courtroom embarrasses everyone present and turns the tables of humiliation upon the creditor for causing it. Unlike last week, we will not have a live demonstration. Unless they're volunteers, but I don't know. But you can imagine the mayhem and the hilarity that ensued. Jesus' idea worked because looking upon someone's nakedness in those days violated a cultural taboo that put the curse of Cain upon the one gazing at this nude spectacle. Which is to say that the debtor is not half as humiliated in that culture as the creditor. Boy, look what I did now. I'm responsible for this scene, he laments, averting his eyes. Again, working within the confining dictates of the culture's rules and norms, Jesus employs another brilliant tactic. The debtor does not end up in jail, but comes out ahead, provided he conquers any hang-ups he has about displaying his nakedness. Then again, consider his options. Jail and a displaced family. Nudity. That's a no-brainer. But notice how the man even acts with efficiency, saving himself any potential future problems by already giving up his undergarments without being asked. Now, there's nothing left for which to sue. Yeah, take my jockey shorts too, why don't you? In the process, then, the debtor unmasks this improper, unethical behavior that's being perpetrated upon him, and does so by a lampooning act of burlesque. He encounters this absurd idea of suing a pauper with his own absurd behavior. In the end, he invites not retribution, but laughter. The way of Jesus brings smiles. The same smiles to those faces and laughs to those faces as we had a few minutes ago when it was explained to you what would happen. This stuff works. It's real. I do have to say, though, how unnecessary all of this would have been if only the creditor had followed Jesus' advice to forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's not as though he hadn't been told. Going the extra mile. Again, a little background. Roman armies of occupation regularly moved through the towns and villages of every country conquered by the empire, including Palestine. You did that as a show of force, to keep people in check. Oh, here comes the army. They didn't have police forces. The army was the police force. They didn't have beat cops. The army was the police force. And so brutal was the military when commandeering property and pressing unwilling civilians into service that history records entire towns fleeing as the army approached. Anybody watch the American Revolution on PBS this week? Same thing. Those armies, whether they were the American armies or the British armies or the French armies, when they came through a town, people scattered. Now, wealthier individuals in Jesus' day could pay heavy bribes to have the soldiers leave them alone. So there are two options, either run away or bribery. Well, they're not always possible for poor people. So once again, Jesus suggests a third way. When the soldier has you travel the legal limit of 1 mile to carry his pack, go an additional mile. You see, the law allowed aiding a soldier for up to 1 mile. Any additional distance, as Jesus suggests, was illegal for the soldier to take advantage of. So, when the soldier's captain, the centurion, sees someone going the extra mile with one of his soldiers, a court-martial is in order. Now who's in trouble? What's the soldier to say? The Jew volunteered? Oh yeah, his commanding officer is going to believe that one, right? Jews just love to help the army that was oppressing them. Yet even if the centurion does not see the infraction that his soldier commits, other soldiers will see it. And at the very least, there will be some mocking from them. Plus, a Jew traversing the extra mile may well get the soldier himself a bit anxious and upset without any input from a captain or peers. Just nervous about all this. This ain't right. You see, the Roman soldier knows that he is despised by the citizenry. Honestly, not unlike persons who dislike ICE agents today in our nation, right? And so the kindness Jesus suggests is unheard of. And it would have been highly suspect by the soldiers. I mean, the soldier had to wonder, what's this Hebrew up to? You know, is this some sort of a provocation that I'm missing? Is this some kind of a new insult that's coming my way? Is this guy creating trouble or what? Such an unforeseen, unpredictable act throws the soldier off balance, giving the victim the upper hand of surprise. Ideally, that unsuspecting soldier may even be forced to beg that his equipment be returned to him. So worried is he about what may happen next with this crazy Palestinian. I mean, how humorous for everyone watching, yet how humiliating for that soldier as, again, his peers look on in mocking derision. Just the opposite of what one would expect. Jesus' teaching succeeds in turning the tables in favor of the downtrodden yet again. At a June annual conference of the Eastern Pennsylvania United Methodists 9 years ago in Lancaster, an uninvited young man showed up Thursday afternoon distributing hateful literature. He announced an agenda which condemned people for all sorts of behavior with which he disagreed. A colleague of mine politely asked him to leave. He did not, so security showed him the door. The following evening, there was a worship service of ordination at First United Methodist Church of Lancaster, about 3.5 blocks from the Marriott Convention Center where we were. And so on a busy Friday evening in the city, hundreds of pastors in liturgical garb gathered in a long line to make our way to the church. Pretty impressive sight. You don't see that every day in Lancaster. Maybe the occasional buggy, right? But not hundreds of clergy dressed like this. Well, guess who joined us along the route? That young troublemaker. Only this time, he had a megaphone. And he spied the pastor who had him removed the day before, the pastor with whom I was walking, and he began barking nasty stuff at him about abortion and human sexuality and the end of the world. You know the drill. Now, other pastors, some quite calm, some loud, they are preachers, they came to their brother's defense, but they could not dissuade this instigator. Up and down the line, the rabble-rouser went, screaming at us, all as the city's equestrian mounted police patrol looked on, freedom of speech. Several minutes into the tirade, and frustrated at his ability to not be able to faze us, the young man cut loose with the F-bomb. And lots of F-bombs. Well, that was it. A pastor from Ghana, and I tipped off Isaac that I'd be talking about this, so he said he'd be watching. He's out of town today, so good morning, Isaac. Here's the Ghana pastor story. A pastor from Ghana who was serving in the Poconos at the time began singing the African song, Siahamba. We are marching. That's why you sang it. That simple melody with its simple lyrics. They were known by all of us. And so we subsequently joined in and followed Pastor Kofi. I mean, a few hundred United Methodist pastors singing at full voice filled the streets. It drowned out this foul-mouthed megaphone man. What a witness! It was spectacular. It was exciting. It was inspirational. Because when we do best what we're best at, which for United Methodist clergy is singing the songs of faith, we defeat evil without resorting to anything unseemly. We lived Jesus' teaching by being aggressively non-violent. So what does all of this mean? What does it really reveal about Jesus and his will for how we are to live as his disciples? 3 points. First, let's be clear that Jesus is not suggesting some legalistic, literalistic set of rules for engagement to be used for all time. His ideas may not work precisely each time. As a matter of fact, they may work only once. Because the enemy's going to catch on. Not all enemies are dummies. But Jesus is suggesting that we always draw on the creatively wise power of the Holy Spirit in developing a third way to combat violence with nonviolence. And even though that battle tactic must regularly change, the overall strategy of nonviolence ends up breaking the cycle and efficiently works to win the day. By the way, this concept puts the familiar hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers, into an entirely new light. That song is not about armed, militaristic kind of stuff. It's about using spiritual warfare to defeat evil. We'll be singing that as our closing hymn. Second, Jesus is quite clear about loving our enemies, especially in Luke's version of this passage from last week, as well as in the verses after today's lesson that I did not read. Because Jesus will tolerate violence from no one, especially from his disciples. He gives us tools to live that peaceful ethic. I mean, violent protesters on our streets today who claim to be persons of faith could really learn a lesson from Jesus here. It's not just some pie-in-the-sky idealism which he espouses. Jesus is not merely an ideologue. He is a leader truly interested in practical, peaceful results for his people, for all people. As his followers, then, we are not to engage in threats, intimidation, power plays, violence. Creating anxiety and uncertainty among our persecutors, though, those are tactics employed to provoke a change in behavior. And while, yes, they destabilize enemies and they are pretty darn persuasive, they do not countenance violence. Writes New Testament scholar Walter Wink, quote, "By refusing to be awed by power, the powerless are emboldened to seize the initiative," end quote. We assert our God-given dignity in a situation that cannot, for the time being, be changed. The oppressed take back the power of choice. Submission to evil is not the will of God. We are to engage in humility without being humiliated. I mean, armed revolution would have led to abject disaster in Jesus' day and a certain catastrophe in most cases where these situations were provoked. I mean, the Jews' heart-rending defeat at Masada's mountaintop fortress in AD 70 proved that violent rebellion against Rome could not work. But think about it. You know these stories from the Old Testament. The best victories are won when God fights for the Hebrews by using tactics that outwit the opponents. Think about those 10 plagues which helped free the slaves in Egypt. Think about Jericho's walls that came tumbling down after a worship ritual, not armed military conflict. Think about the Midianites who were routed in Judges 7 by Gideon's army of soldiers who had only torchlights and trumpets. But also recognize that Jesus' methods did incite a social revolution that sparked a political revolution, but not an armed revolution. Because after all, Christianity vanquished Rome when Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan made this illegal, persecuted Christian faith the official religion of the empire in 313 AD. Without a sword being raised, or even a sword being rattled, there were short-term losses for long-term gains for Jesus' followers. I mean, you get hit once, as we learned last week. But if you offer the other cheek, you can't get hit again. Third thing, and finally, Jesus' third way. There's fight, there's flight, running away, or there's a third way, aggressive nonviolence. Jesus' third way is yet another sign of God's reign breaking into the world as something that is both relevant and real. Christianity is not pie-in-the-sky fantasy and wishful thinking as many charge. It is the kingdom breaking into our hearts, then breaking out of us through acts of love. It is the fact that we do not make threats. We do not intimidate. We do not conduct power plays. We do not become violent. We are the leaven causing the dough to rise up, as Jesus said. We oppose evil without mirroring it. We resist oppression without emulating it. We neutralize an enemy without destroying it. Nonviolence does not lead to some magical tranquility, but it does confront evil with justice and mercy that keeps both opponents from resorting to further violence and sin. Ultimately, God's goodness prevails by revealing Christian love for our enemies, and maybe even helping them to learn to love too. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.